think it's time to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. So the flow of this, yes. Okay. So the flow of this is OpenPrice recently ran a very comprehensive survey with lots of questions, which resulted in a ton of data that's really fascinating. And as the person who had to write the report and analyze the data, I can tell you that there's a lot of information. So we're only going to cover a part of it today, but we will have a QR code so you can download the whole thing in its entirety. So let's start with introductions. Allie, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Allie Rustiello. I am the VP of RevOps for Health Catalyst. My background is deep marketing ops, and I transitioned to full RevOps in this last role. And I'm super excited to share all my experience with you guys.
Trevor.
I'm Trevor. I lead business technology at Miro, and I partner with revenue teams constantly. And this survey spoke loudly to a lot of areas that I struggle with and that I succeed in as well too. So excited to chat through it all with a great panel here. Jeff, I'll ping pong to you.
Awesome. Name is Jeff Ignacio, lead of revenue operations and strategy over at Regrow Ag, a climate-focused agriculture mission company. And I also produce as much RevOps helpful content to the community. So thankful for the RevOps Co-op.
Awesome. And I'm Kamala Thompson. You probably or might recognize me. I am head of marketing here at the RevOps Co-op, RevOps veteran, did that for 15 years across all sorts of B2B SaaS companies. And I'm a podcaster. And so is Jeff. I just thought I'd mention that. All right. So what we're going to talk about first is what the survey says, why it says that, and then we're going to turn to the panel on what exactly tactically and strategically we can do to improve. So today we're going to talk about operational maturity. And first, we want to really talk about what that means and how OpenPrice specifically measured it. So they were looking across 3 different pillars: go-to-market alignment, data management, and RevTech stack. So these may seem a little bit obvious, but team would love to hear your thoughts on why we're still talking about things like go-to-market alignment and data management. Anybody who wants to take it.
Is it easy to start with? They're hard. They're difficult.
Yeah.
They're difficult things to tackle, and they constantly change as your company grows as well too. And I think from my perspective, the delineation of ownership changes substantially as the company grows as well too. So it's an always on function and always on to be continuously improving. So I think that's why we're always talking about it, but open to others' thoughts as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I think when it comes to alignment, I think we have to be very thoughtful around the stage of the company. So in the early days, the company is really focused on building and experimenting and figuring out what works. And then once they start putting the foot on the gas pedal, they start scaling. And once you've sufficiently scaled, it's all about optimization. And sometimes companies going through those transitions find themselves in a spot where they have processes or metrics or roles and responsibilities that don't quite fit the next stage of the company. And so I always think that alignment is always going to be a holy grail that we shoot for, because change is constant in any business. But one thing that I think we can hedge against is, operating from one single source of truth or a common set of definitions across the business, and a revenue operating model where the goals are linked and tied and where everyone can play their part, but yet work on a team goal.
I think it has to do a lot with also your product changing. I mean, we're in tech, product is constantly changing, your offering changes. Maybe you go into a different market, maybe you go into a whole different segment of your market. So every time that you have some sort of product change, that means that you have to figure out a new go-to-market strategy. That could be new teams, new alignment across the board. So there's just this constant element of change that you always have to think about and adapt to. And that goes for your data management and your RevTech stack as well, because all of those things power your entire function.
So so many thoughts and feelings. We're definitely going to be talking about how we've seen it work well and not well and what we recommend, but want to keep moving forward on the results. So how mature are we on average? Honestly, it's somewhere in the middle. Looking at the data, it definitely skewed towards the left a bit, so less mature. And we're all really struggling with each of these pillars. Not all of it is within RevOps court to completely influence, which we'll get into a bit later. And then the other question we asked as part of the survey, which I thought was very interesting, was, well, what about the organizations with formal RevOps structure, multi-team, multi-department support? Those were better, right? No, there was no statistical variation if there was a formal RevOps team or a department, or if there was like a tiger team that came across different siloed organizations. In both of those populations, our maturity was skewing the same as siloed organizations. So now we're going to get into the group's opinions a bit more. Why aren't RevOps teams aligning companies and improving operational maturity? So some opinion pieces. And then Jeff, this is really speaking to both your maturity of the company and stage of the company. And also we need to talk about how differently different companies structure revenue operations. So at the highest level, we were split pretty evenly between there's siloed departments that meet together as a RevOps team, and then there's a formal RevOps department. So it's still very spread out amongst those categories. There isn't one distinct uniform way that we define revenue operations. And who revenue operations reports to was really all over the place. A good percentage, I'd say about 42% reported to the CRO, and then they were evenly split amongst the others. But before we move on, what's a CRO? I give that to the group.
You want
I
the
would
ideal answer?
say,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say that, your typical CRO usually owns sales, marketing, and customer like expansion and growth and things like that. That being said, I know that there's a lot of CROs out there with that title that don't own all of that.
Yeah, and I've found they tend to come from a sales background. Do you all see that as well? In
Yes.
B2B specifically?
Yeah, I've seen that as well too. I think especially when a company is scaling, it's helpful to come from that sales background for blitz scaling or for initial growth of a company. But I find when companies become more mature, having someone that's a little bit more focused on customer retention or coming from a CS or CX background tends to have a lot of benefit for orgs as well too, to focus more on nurturing and expanding upon current customers rather than just obtaining new customers.
Yeah, I
do.
always
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I find that you can say tongue in cheek that a CRO in many instances is a glorified, sales leader in some ways. And you can see that it's evidence because of how many CMO, CRO pairings there are in many companies. And so what that often leaves is that the marketing top of funnel is a partnership with the CRO, who's then focused on acquisition as well as expansion. And I think that over the last 5-10 years, you've seen the customer success function move over underneath the CRO, and that's changed the targets and goals of many CS departments from just renewal and customer health to expansion, NRR being a core metric that a lot of CS groups are now measured on.
Yeah, and I see that as a super positive change, but I do have to bring up the fact that it's just human nature that we're going to focus on and try to fix the areas that we're most familiar with and understand the best. So I see a lot of divided attention in CROs in a lot of cases. There are some out there who are fantastic at looking across the org and focusing on where needs the most help. But in a lot of instances, I do see people hyper-focusing on where they came from and what they know best. That's just human nature. So, Jeff, we'll start with you. As we were sitting and discussing the results and the recommendations made by OpenPrice based on the data, we also had some kind of peripheral, but very core things that we felt were influencing this lack of alignment. So Jeff, let's start with number 2, which I think was your contribution.
Yeah, if we did a family feud style, we could start throwing it up to the community. See what were the top 5 reasons by the panelists. So the first
Yeah.
one that I shot out there was that I think we as a RevOps profession, a community, are underselling our value within the business. I think many times we do such great work behind the scenes, but it's hard to communicate the ultimate impact or the why we're doing such things. So change management is such a big, important thing that I think RevOps folks can master. And second is, it's okay to be loud and proud of the work that we do, but you have to be able to communicate it in context of why the business is improving with the process improvements or systems improvements that we're making.
Yeah, and
I
then
agree
Allie,
with that, and I think it's hard to sell that value and that impact because what we do is deeply technical, and most of the people we're trying to sell it to aren't, and it's kind of hard to get them to buy into that that vision you have, or that real version of that impact, especially when it's at an executive level where they have very short attention spans because they are ingesting so much information all the time about every department or everything they're leading, right? I tend to have to go to if I was building a house, or if we're talking about a recipe for food, because food is life and we all talk about food, it unites the world. I start talking in relating ways that they can understand it to everyday things.
and then I'm going to kick it back to you for a lot of that is out of our control, because when we were talking about the results, and particularly with go-to-market alignment, we've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and I'll just let you take it from there when it comes to leadership influence.
Yeah, it is. I feel, especially the way that we position RevOps, it tends to sit either in the sales org or in some sort of finance org or middle ground org. And it's meant to be a balance and be impartial. But when you do that, you have a lot of angst from certain teams that maybe feel like there's not enough trust there, or they are not in control of their own reporting and story of their performance. And it just can breed a lot of just anxiety across the org and friction, right? The other piece is that we are a supporting mechanism. We are not the strategy leader for like how we're going to market. So when we come in and say, well, we think we need to align this, and this is what goals need to be, they're like, whoa, 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 time out. Like, you're just supporting us. We make the decisions. And so you need that C-level alignment right away, and they need to understand and really partner on the goals of what all of the organizations in the go-to-market orgs are aligning to. If they don't, there is no chance that any of the teams do. So you've got to be able to do that influence at your CMO level, at your CRO, CSO, whatever we are calling the sales leader now, and beyond. Mine extends into finance as well. So there's a lot that we have to support and partner to drive alignment.
Influencing without authority is kind of our life, and we can't control what leadership allows across teams. So if they're not living company values and mission and allowing managers to snipe at each other openly in meetings in front of everybody, we're going to have a harder time getting the teams aligned with what we can control. Trevor, I'd like to kick it over to you and begin the discussion with, as a company matures.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll double click on what Ali mentioned, like from my perspective, being very crystal clear on your role and like who the teams that you are supporting and what are your main functions, and like screaming that from the rooftops is like one of the most important kind of functions as the team grows like this. And I think as the company matures, you end up garnering more real estate within your house or within your land. And to Ali's point, maybe that starts to include finance maybe that starts to include success or digital success or kind of email marketing groups. And when that's done, it requires a recalibration with all your stakeholders that you're now kind of the partner for these groups to interface with the rest of the business. And that constant communication and that constant awareness of who you are and what your goals are and what your mission is as a team is constantly changing. And then I think while that's happening, while you're grabbing new teams, your business is expanding as well too. Ali made a really great point that as a company grows, you start to sell different products. Maybe you have some mergers and acquisitions where you're now taking on some additional products or taking on some additional regions that you didn't have, that have complexities that you weren't privy to before. That changes your capacity model, that changes your ability to execute on previous things that used to be a shoe-in for you. So making sure that you have time allocated for that to kind of revisit what you've built, whether that's in people, process, or technology, as you go and scale, I think is extremely important that you're not just that you're continuing to improve your house or your kitchen, to follow that analogy a little bit more before continuing to buy real estate around you or buy the lots next to you. And that constantly changes, and that's an always on function that I've seen our team here sometimes forget about, and other teams that I speak with forget about at times as well too. So those are some of the challenges, and maybe some thoughts around how to make sure you maintain focus on that. But that's what I've seen from my side, Kamala.
Then Jeff, I'd love for you to add a little more nuance about how much people need to adapt as a company grows.
So real life example, right? So the first company that I joined that was like not a large company, I joined them at sub 10 million in ARR, and in 3 years we had grown to over 75 million. And in that growth phase, we had some rapid transitions. We went from a primarily network-based selling, like selling within our networks, to going cold outbound. So we would see our win rates drop and our sales cycles go up and our CAC go up as well. And then once we learned that motion, we saw those numbers all trend in the right direction. Then the second thing we did was we had to layer on an account-based marketing approach, because now we were selling to companies that weren't leaning in. They weren't your first movers. These were folks that were more hesitant and they needed proof and reference. So we had to build all sorts of new processes. So again, all of our processes that got us to the point where we were at that point were no longer yielding the type of results that we needed. And then a year later, we started to shift towards selling to the international audience, and international companies operated quite differently. And typically an American-based company is going to start with, let's sell to other English-speaking nations. So England, Singapore, Australia. So as we started expanding into those areas, we found cultural differences in how to sell as well. We also found time zone differences. So every step along the way, you're technically doing something new, and your playbook that you have in place, it's going to be rewritten no matter what. So as you're continuing to grow, the part of the challenge is, well, my body's going to feel sore if I'm taking on a new level of weights. I'm going to have to eventually settle in. And then sooner or later, it's just easy. And then I move on to the next challenge. Same thing happens with go-to-market. So that's the constant reason why our as a RevOps org, we're constantly having to bob and weave with the times.
Absolutely. And another just like really simple illustration, lead gating. Very, very early on in a startup, sales is going to be hungry for anything because there's next to zero awareness. As a company scales, how you look at what's coming through the door and how you refine your definition of an ideal customer profile is going to completely change that one workflow. So I totally agree. It's a lot of adaptation in every sense of the word. So as most of us know in RevOps, whenever we're looking for a silver bullet, there usually isn't one. So we're going to look at what the survey told us in terms of what highly sophisticated companies were doing differently than people who had more of an early maturity environment, and then we'll have the panel fill in and maybe give some tangible examples. So with go-to-market alignment, Ali, I took this straight from you. We can't fix bad behavior.
No, we can't fix that, but we can make systems that scale and processes that really help us be more efficient along the way. My mantra is that we are always here to act as a consultant to the business. And so when the marketing team wants to do a new program that's completely different than anything else they've ever done, we should be in the forefront of that conversation so that we know how to track and manage and do all the systems approaches to what they want to do. It is not our place to necessarily say that that is the right or wrong approach. It is, this is how we can track it in the systems, and this is the way that, you know, we think we'll see success and how it's the most efficient way to do it. If we get the systems and that sort of that data, that underlying data piece correct, execution becomes exponentially easier. Without that underlying data being the way that it, like, you know, think of it as like almost tracks on a roller coaster. If you have a bunch of tracks missing, you're going to roll off the, you might go off the cliff, and that is not good for anybody. So if you have all of your data tracks and your systems running as efficiently as possible, then weathering that change and weathering that bad behavior is much easier to deal with.
And there's a reason why anytime I walk into a company, I start with analyzing the handoffs. One, it's a great way to learn your systems because you're looking at data and how it flows through multiple systems that different teams use. And then two, it really is a jumpstart into identifying which teams have the most friction and where we need to focus the most on aligning definitions, processes, systems. I'm going to open this up to Jeff and Trevor. Do you have anything to add here, particularly around the systems and tools and skills that we have listed here?
Yeah, I think one thing that hits home for me, especially in this world we're in now with generative AI, is we can begin to fix bad behavior. We're not babysitters, or we're not counselors, but we can take information that was once either transcripted through a human's positive brain and put into a forecast, a la what Jeff and I were just going back and forth on in the Slack, or sorry, in the chat. But we can use this generative AI to identify bottlenecks in process, to identify bottlenecks and handoffs, leads that aren't being activated, leads that aren't being called upon, and make those steps for them. I think one thing that I'm trying to challenge my team to do is, if we're being told something needs to take place, leads need to be called upon, ask what the next 3 steps are that you're expecting, from that the sales leader or the marketing leader is expecting. Let's just go automate those 3 steps too. There's no reason that we need to sit there and put that on a human to go do. So we should be doing that all ourselves, and we should be challenging ourselves to how many of these steps can we take upon ourselves. And especially like at a larger company where folks are in place, that's great. That saves time, it saves money, it saves cost of ownership. But at a small company, when you're really getting going, can really save on hiring of whether it's BDRs, whether it's lead profile kind of on the marketing side. All of these areas can really be saved if we lean into enrichment, if we lean into process optimization through workflows or through generative AI. Can really set yourself apart, I think, in your career, but also set your team apart as someone who solves greater problems than what the ones that are just being presented to them. So those are some of the points that hit home for me when Ali was walking through fixing bad behavior, which I think is a challenge in a lot of ways.
Jeff, I'm holding this question for you. So we can't fix bad behavior, but what if everything is configured to surface bad behavior and nothing is done about it? How do you handle that? And for example, one rep is not working through leads, but the majority are.
Well, I think you have to start coming up with the consequences of such actions, right? So if you put together a playbook that has a series of, documented procedures, you've streamlined everything on the behalf, then ultimately folks aren't doing their jobs, and you have to live with the consequences of that. Because in a sales role, for example, if you're not doing your job in terms of meeting your activity levels, having the productivity, doing the training, incorporating those new changes, you're ultimately not going to perform. And that's the fastest way to a performance improvement plan. And that's pretty easy for a sales organization to detect. And so those individuals are going to be washed out of the org pretty quickly. And so we want to change bad behaviors because hopefully you've defined what good behavior is. And that good behavior is grounded in data, grounded in experimentation, and is going to, on average, lead to positive outcomes. And so I think how we push changes out to the org and how it's adopted is what ultimately matters. And sure, there's probably 1 or 2 apples that fall off a tree and don't follow the process. But you want to also have a elevator and a de-escalator off the to get off the train if you have folks who aren't following through.
I'll be the first to admit I wasn't good at this and I burned out twice before I learned how to do this. But sometimes you have to focus on what you can influence and let some things go and let people fail. And
That's
it's
a hard
really
one.
hard to do.
It's so hard. I had a boss at one time that she basically told me, you need to stop doing the dive and save. And I was like, the what? She's like, the dive and save. You see a problem, you immediately dive it, save it, like dive in, save it, and everybody looks great, but you're all stressed out because you just took care of everything. And I was like, okay, I mean, that just goes against every fiber of my being, but okay. I'll also say too that in the sales world, it is a little bit easier to identify where bad behavior is happening. I think it's harder on the marketing side because there is so many places that bad behavior can break something and you don't have a lot of insight to it. If someone's not properly using UTM parameters, if someone isn't uploading a list appropriately, like there's a few different things that go on that are always sort of like the bane of the existence for the marketing ops team, that really, it's very difficult to be that person that's like, we couldn't have caught this because we didn't even know it was happening, or because you did this, like the system isn't even able to recognize anything. So I think that the bad behavior piece, as much as you can set up people up for success in the beginning by training and guiding and being that consultant, is the easier way to kind of thwart off that bad behavior.
And I just want to add one thing before we move on to the next point. If that person isn't following up on the leads as expected and they're still killing it, there is an opportunity for you to learn something. Is the rest of the sales team wasting time on leads that are not going to convert? Is there something we can do to improve our process? So if somebody's getting away with it because they're still doing really well, there's something that you can take and learn from them, even if you can't force them to change their behavior.
Agreed. I think like revisiting as you grow on as well too, you find like, oh, why isn't this being followed? Why isn't this process being followed? Like we set this up, like put yourself in their shoes sometimes. Go do their job for a day or for an hour and let yourself like live their life and determine whether or not you would want to do that or whether or not there's holes in the process. I think you put on these like shiny goggles that everything's great and you've set up this perfect process, but in reality, like maybe you didn't. And maybe if you double click into it, or maybe it's been 2 years since you've made any modifications to this process, maybe you're just living on debt as you've scaled as well too. So that's another thing I'm trying to focus on myself as well over these next 6 months.
Yeah, I would chime in. If you have the opportunity to do a sidecar, right? Join in on an SDR call, join in on a demo, walk them, at the end, look at the follow-ups, right? Like at the end of the demo, what are the steps that they need to do afterwards? Just do a sidecar with people and just take a look. I'm like, well, I laid out this process, but you're not doing it because you found a better way, but it's offline. Now let's make that better process from offline to online. So those are some great opportunities to, be in touch with your org and learn from them.
I love that.
And it's like similar to setting up a customer advisory board, right, Jeff? Like all companies do this as they want to learn more. You should have the same with your teams, with your marketing groups, with your sales groups. You should have a core set of people that are intrigued in operations and are operationally minded individuals that can give a stream of insight. And you should have some bandwidth in your capacity model to work on these things to improve, because those are multipliers. Just in the same way that net new initiatives are opening up new regions or opening up new markets, like this is the same multiplier to save time, to save money for the company.
That
Yeah,
is such a great.
find your champions that will help you roll out something new or roll out a change, or can be your guinea pig when you're trying to roll out something new in general, to test and see if this is something that will work well or not.
And I don't know if you all have found this, but I've found that usually the people who start out as the biggest, loudest objector turn into your champion if you show them that, yes, I'm listening to you, I'm taking your advice, we're changing some things, and here's how we put it in place. But you have to communicate that back to them. I don't know if you guys have had similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta have trust. Trust is earned, and it's a two-way street, right? It's not given. So you need to show that you're there to listen to them and that you'll deliver on what they're saying. If you just give them an avenue to listen, but you don't deliver any of it, they're gonna stop giving you that feedback.
Yeah.
Yes and no. Some of the people who've complained to me the most continue to complain to me the most, but I would never ask them to be anything different because they do tend to, provide valuable feedback. So
Yeah,
it comes both ways.
I agree. That loud person can be the person that's just speaking for the majority, the people that will sit in silence and suffer. So I don't necessarily want to ever shut somebody down, but I do want to try to get them on my side.
So, Trevor, you had some great points when we were talking offline about process documentation and how that tends to be a really big gap. Do you want to fill that in a little bit?
Sure. I think it's two things that, especially that's keen to me now. Like the company I work at now grew extremely quickly, and just what I was referring to, like we didn't take the time to do user journey mapping, we didn't take time to do process mapping, and so just what I was hitting on, like we assume that these processes are rock solid or that they're in good shape, but in reality they're not. And I think Jeff's makes a really good point. Like, go join a demo, see how quick it takes them to take in all the feedback, to update the fields in Salesforce, to give the update back to their manager on the forecast. Like, go follow that path, and like that's business process optimization, but it's also user journey mapping, and that may change for your strategic reps who maybe are having more strategic conversations versus maybe your lower end like kind of churn and burn type reps. It's two different user journeys that you should be building as you're growing like a CRM, and or as you're growing a company as well too. So my last point on this is that you can save so much time in interviews and conversations with different folks in your team if you just write down what it is that you did and put it into a business map. You'll probably save, as you grow your team or as you grow your company, you'll probably save 2 to 3 hours a week in calls that you didn't need to have because you just sent a doc of what you built, and they could read that and ask a few questions. Like, I can't tell you how many hours I wasted just explaining what was already built because I didn't write it down. And there's a lot of great tools out there now too that are doing kind of this on an AI level. They're doing this mapping for you and building these areas for you. And there's only going to be more to come. So focusing in on this can save 10x of time for your team as they grow as well.
We use one that captures your movements in, like, if you're like in Salesforce and you're building out a new process for somebody to follow, it captures it into like a video and then can put it into the snippets into a document. Saved us a million times over when we were launching CPQ.
Awesome. And it's funny, even system issues can be a sign of misalignment or silos and not listening enough for opportunities to improve something. So great example. Marketing says we passed 50 leads over this week, and sales says, no, you didn't. There might be an integration issue. All right, data management. This is a tricky one because we all know it's kind of a mess, and some things will always be a mess to a certain degree, particularly prospect data and how many people turn over so regularly. But would love to talk through, I put some priorities up here and how you should address data. Agree, disagree? What are folks' thoughts on that?
It's also
Yeah.
important. I don't know what's most important. All of it's important.
I think it depends on the audience and who's looking at the data. Go to market, I'm going to be looking at the customer data for the most part. If I'm in finance or in an executive role, I'm going to care about the financial data. And the product, if I'm in CS or in finance ops, I'm going to care about more of the product billing and the contract. I think it depends on who your audience is.
Yeah, and I was really thinking about this from the perspective of somebody who's had to report to the board. And one of the most embarrassing things you can do is report a completely different number than finance and other folks on your team. And they really need to know that information in order to figure out whether or not they're going to keep you as a company they're going to fund in the future. So I don't think there's really a right answer.
Yeah, for me, it's like the marriage of all three that ends up being like the most important to me. Like, what are your data models that support marrying all these data points together so that everyone's talking the same language? Like, what's visible in your product is presented to the customer at the same time when your CSMs are going to talk to the customers. Like, understanding each one of these points together is probably the most challenging piece in my eyes. Especially since the skill sets of each group managing it and the need for business knowledge becomes extremely difficult. So I think a world of analytics and analytics engineers that are business savvy is probably the next level of growth in these type of teams.
That's
I really think that all three of these, you're just basically describing the full picture of the customer journey with you.
Mhm.
And the reason they're all three important and so hard to say one's more important than the other is that throughout that journey, different pieces of this data is what's important to what you're building or the person that you're working with on any team is building, right? So there's not a right or wrong answer, but our jobs are to paint that entire picture and build systems that can surface all of it, which is incredibly hard and why I think we're seeing some of the data in this survey the way we are.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
also. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so the board report is such an important meeting, and it's hugely embarrassing when marketing and sales report on a similar KPI and the numbers are different. Same with the finance data. Bookings, for example, is a key metric that blends across both. Now, what you want to do there is you want to give yourself ample time for a dress rehearsal, and you want to have enough time to have a narrative that's bolted down. And so, yes, you're layering on a ton of time and more cadences before you go to that ultimate business rhythm of the board meeting. But then it all starts from definitions as well of your KPIs. And hopefully you're grounding that data from the same place, from the same
Yeah.
sources. So same source, same definitions. And if you can't get there, explain the nuance and then give yourself enough ample time to do the dress rehearsals. It's not just for board meetings, it's also for your QBRs or your MBRs. And if you're in an IC position, tighten up the data that you're bringing to the table. And if you're a leader, spend a lot of time on the QA, because when you're not in a position where you have strong data maturity, you can end up in those situations where you embarrass yourself.
Yeah. The how did we get to this number can always be a gotcha if you don't understand the way that the logic was configured or the calculations were configured. And I think that a lot of the senior leaders kind of overlook that and they think they can just talk it over or like talk around it. But certain boards are like, no, how you get there. And certain boards maybe don't care about that as much. It really depends in knowing who your audience is.
Yeah, when I advise AI companies who are trying to answer questions on the fly, I'm like, okay, but where can RevOps lock in the data definition and exactly which filters and data you exclude and all of these things? Because that is the biggest time suck any reporting cycle is
Yep.
figuring out which filters somebody forgot to put in. But that leads me to the skills that are really necessary that I don't always see, that I would like to see more of, which is a really deep understanding of relational databases, maybe a query language, in addition to that business knowledge. If you can get both of those.
Yeah. I have an analyst that's worked for me several different times who just has this insane business knowledge. And then also that underlying data, he's so valuable. Like I can't afford him anymore. And it makes me sad.
That's the
Or like,
unicorn.
Yeah.
also the decision you make with purchasing tools like plays into this substantially too. I think we're in this world now where like folks have 4 different engines for prospecting, for call recording, for CRM, maybe even having 2 different CRMs in some cases as well too. Like I think the fight or the race for RevTech to meet at a central point where folks can just use one of these many tools that are out there makes this process so much simpler. I think the skill set is great on data governance and data analysis, but I think the skill set that's missed sometimes is integration layer, integration lead, integration developer, the people that are responsible for tying these data sets together is almost more important than aggregating it. Aggregating, it's easy as long as it's right. But if it's wrong, then you got to go back to the source and figure out the whole integration layer, which I think hits on Jeff's point of if you know the source is solid, you can spend more time on the presentation, but if you're spending all the time on the source, your presentation is going to be lacking sorely.
And it's order of operations there too, because if you have an enrichment tool that's constantly going through the data, but you have a sales team that has more current data that they are manually taking the time to enter and you overwrite that, it's just not good. You need a lot of rules in place. You have to think through so much stuff. Is there anything else we want to cover on data management before we move to the RevTech stack?
I think we covered it.
Show me the tech.
It's hard.
Show you the what?
Show me the tech.
All right. So Jeff, I stole this one from you, so we're going to start with you. We're talking about efficiency and how cost of lead, cost of opportunity, all of those things are more important than ever. How does RevTech stack play into that?
So a couple of ways. So most folks think about, let's just cut spend. Let's cut redundant tools. That's the easiest way to cut costs out of the business. But whenever you take a look at total dollars spent on tech relative to headcount, it's minimal. It's de minimis. Like, who cares if we get another $20,000 tool? It doesn't matter. If you let go of one person, that's like 150K saved, right? So it's a big difference between the people and tech spend. But the technology enables the people who are in the boat to row productively, right? So the reason why we need these tools is to make the human capital into efficient capital within the business. And so in my mind, it's making sure that you're unlocking the appropriate capabilities. That's what you see there, maximizing utility. And that should lead to an output, which is the ability to generate more pipe, accelerate sales cycles, find the right information, rope in the right people across the organization at the right time for the right deals. So that type of, outcomes for the business is driven by the revenue technology. I think we can get so wrapped around the axle around, well, I have 2 tools that give me data enrichment. Well, guess what? Most enrichment tools aren't perfect. You probably need 3 or 4 to get even close to being good data. So, in my mind, RevTech is all about what we do with the technology. At marketing, it's going to be reporting, attribution, and lead routing, speed to lead. On the sales side, it's going to be roping and tagging, collaborating others inside the sales cycle, making sure that you can get to the right capacity. So number of accounts, number of prospects, number of leads that a rep can work on. And then for CS, it's getting those signals around the customer base so that you can act effectively to helping the customer unlock their journey.
So let's see hands on the panel. Who has had somebody come to them and say, if we buy this tool, it's going to fix all these problems?
Just happened to me this morning.
If I hear one more
Explain to
person-
me why that isn't the case.
I think in my opinion, you need centralized folks on your team that are looking at these problems like agnostically and holistically across the organization. So architect teams is kind of, when you reach a certain level, is a really important skill set, someone that can orchestrate the different avenues that Jeff lined out and push your vendors to deliver these things instead of going around to buying new tools. I think it's an area that I've struggled with in the past and tried to put more onus on. And I saw someone just put in the chat that like, you need to know what the process is and what the business process is before you can go solve any of these problems. Just inserting a technology when the process is faulty is never going to work. The technology is almost its part in a lot of ways. It's figuring out what the proper process is and then baking that in and molding the technology to what you need it to do. I think and like the role of RevTech or business tech, whatever you want to call it, is to take what's existing out of these great platforms and great companies and mold it to how it works for your business. I think that gets lost sometimes as well in the process, and it's a key piece of keeping things moving and always improving.
Allie, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so for me, I think it is like when we think about what we're in B2B tech, right? Like I'm assuming most of us on this call are. We're all trying to sell a product. Well, so are they. And they're going to go find whoever's going to listen to them in your organization and try to find a champion to go sell their rev technology, all of their rev tech to, right? Their MarTech especially. And I feel like someone is just like, oh, I have this like one little problem that's really for me or maybe my team, and this thing can go and solve it. And they get people all wound up about it.
Mhm.
And you know, because you've already demoed it, you've had it at other companies, you know that it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and it's not really gonna help what you do. I think that's our biggest challenge, is that other people doing the jobs that, we support in RevTech companies, trying to sell back to all of the people that we support and getting them hyped up about something that isn't gonna really fix what the core problem is that they're trying to solve.
But sometimes the best thing I've had happen in order to establish a buying process that was centralized through me is to have somebody make the epic error of buying something that doesn't integrate or doesn't something, and having a ton of egg on their face. And finally we hit rock bottom and say, it's time to centralize the process. In a tiny company, it's really hard to institute structure.
Mhm.
And sometimes I go back to this, you have to know when to let people fail. I didn't let this person buy the product, they just did it, and it just happened not to integrate, and it worked out. But sometimes these things can kind of be a blessing in disguise, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. But, I usually come into an organization and I'm like, nobody's buying anything but me on my team, right? Like we centralize it. It's part of but I usually come into companies that are, I think, a little more advanced
Yep.
than a startup, right? We're at the area usually, or we're growing in a different maturity time. So I usually come in and I like go and find all the pockets of where people are buying stuff and be like, nope, this is the budget and this is what we're working with.
So I do want to move on to skills, because I think each of these slides, we had systems and skills listed, and skills, we really emphasize, I think people get frustrated. We talk at a high level and we really hound on skills at the RevOps co-op, but that's because if you understand the table stakes skill sets, you can transfer them across any CRM, marketing automation platform, whatever. Certain tools work better in certain circumstances, of course, but there are some core skill sets that everybody needs. I would love to open this up. What do you feel is absolutely critical and often missing?
Financial modeling is usually missing. Like understanding that what we're doing overall is to drive that pipeline, and then how do you back out of that target number, that growth number that you need, and how do you do the financials around why you're trying to get there, both from the spin that you're doing in marketing and sales and go to market teams to drive that number forward, the tech you're buying, so all of the justifications that you're using to create buy-in if you have to buy something expensive, etc. I think that just that business knowledge, like we get real excited about people that know data or that like systems and like to build things, but they have to have that business model forefront, right? Like, is this the right thing for the business?
So how do you find time to learn the core skill set you don't have?
You make it. It has
Yeah.
to be part of something that you make time. I think make like a monthly learning day or something like that on your team's calendar and push that they should all have areas that they're focusing on, and give them some time back in their day or in their month to focus on that, and give them budget to go after certifications that they want. It'll keep people around also, and it'll keep people energized and happy as well. Jeff, I think I cut you off. Go ahead.
Now I was going to chime in and say the same thing. Make time. Easier said than done. So you have to force a trade-off. The trade-off is lack of sleep, or not focusing on the things that don't matter, dropping the things that don't matter. And it's painful for a time being, meaning you might have to stretch, the time that you're putting into something. But once you've learned it, it's something that can't be taken away from you. So once you have that skill, like once upon a time, I was working as a financial analyst, and I had before my ops career, and I was in Excel hell. I think a lot of folks have been there before, and I just remember doing the same thing week after week after week, and I thought there's got to be a way to automate this. So I picked up a book called "Automate the Boring Stuff," and it was a book on Python, and it just blew my mind. And I finally put in the time to like automate my work. And what I was taking 40 hours to do before crushed down to like 6 hours. And I had all this other time in my life. But those few months where I was learning it, yeah, I was definitely burning the midnight oil. It's not the right answer for everybody, but I would definitely say, drop something or expand the time that you're putting into it. It's going to be painful, but once you learn it can't be undone. It's in your head. You have that skill forever, and it's going to pay off in a huge way for you down the road.
We had a question, would you put general communication skills under documentation and influencing? Yes, and so influencing is really understanding what motivates the people around you and being able to tie what you're doing and what needs to happen to what motivates them and what they care about, and not basing it on the argument that will always fail is I need more resources because I don't have enough time to do X, Y, Z. You have to tie it to company core objectives and KPIs if you want more resources, and a really compelling argument. Documentation, I would say communication is really critical in enablement, which is what a lot of us do, because we have to start with what's in it for me. We have to start with the punchline. We have to tell them why this thing is going to make their life easier. So yes, communication threads through all of these things in a really fundamental way, but understanding what motivates and what other team members care about is really critical in getting anything over the finishing line, in my opinion. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I just have two thoughts on like maybe skills that aren't here that are a little bit more abstract, or like you just hit on it as like relationship building, Kamala. Like you need
Yes.
to learn to build relationships with different people and how to communicate with folks from different backgrounds or that are influenced by different things. And that ties into the output. I think of that as influencing without authority, right? But the input to that is relationship building. And the second piece is like for leaders out there, hire people that are interested in learning new things, maybe that have done different things in their career. Like I think it's a core piece of this group or this type of role is that you're keen to learn new things. You're keen to try different things. You're okay to fail. That's a skill that sometimes is tough to get out in an interview, but it's extremely, maybe when you're doing your background checks or maybe when you're calling on previous employers or mentors, figuring out if they're keen to jump into things that they have no idea about and willing to fail is something that will 10x your team over time also.
And why,
100% agree.
really quickly, I just want to call out that these skills are called out by us because we looked at the report and many of these were either at the bottom of the list or listed as we don't need them for a job. And we all found that astonishing.
Horrified.
Yeah.
I will say this, if you're a leader and you are building teams out, you've got to look across your existing team or non-existent team and also yourself and figure out, what am I not good at? What are they not good at? And then how do I hire to overcome those things? Because to me, that's like a huge blind spot in a lot of leaders, that they think they need to know all the answers. Y'all, I don't know half the answers. I depend on the people around me to help me make the right decisions and figure out what our next steps are or what the next thing that we should be. I'm not I can barely math together to like 2 + 2. Math is not my strong suit, and I run RevOps, which is kind of crazy. But logic and databases and technology is my superpower. And so I use those things to overcome the things that I'm not great at. I feel like a lot of leaders think that they have to be number one in all the things that they lead, and they forget that maybe it's okay not to, and it's okay to hire somebody that's better at something than you are.
Yes.
All the time. Do it. Do it, do it, do it.
So I do want to keep talking skills a little bit, but I do want to give people access to the full survey. Please download it. There was so much in there that frankly surprised me, some in a pleasant way, but mostly we have some work to do. Watch out for an email from OpenPrice. They're going to be sending a self-assessment where you can actually see where your company ranks and get tailored advice on each of the areas. Also have to plug RevOps AF because all of us on this panel are going to be here, and Jeff and I are going to be teaching some really in-depth workshops as well. So if there's any questions out there, now's the time to ask. Also, when you leave, you will be asked to fill out a survey. Please give us details on what we did well and not well so we can make our next webinar even better. So, any last parting thoughts from each of you? Jeff, we haven't heard from you in a while. Any parting thoughts?
If you can, scan the report. There's a lot of goodness in there. So thank you to Open Prize for putting the State of RevOps survey out for everyone. Second, thanks to RevOps Co-op for bringing us together and all the wonderful questions from all the panelists. I'll say this, the #1 skill for RevOps is critical thinking. Think for yourself. You're all problem solvers at heart. You wouldn't have gone into this profession if you weren't. So very grateful to be on this journey of learning with all of you.
Trevor or Allie, you want to jump in?
Sure. Plus to everything Jeff said. Thanks everyone for joining. It was great to talk through some of this, and there's a ton of great information in this survey, whether it's relevant for you in managing your team or relevant for engaging with other teams around you and how you can set up better engagement models for the teams that you work with. I still have not made it through this whole survey. There is so much information in there. So
And I wrote it, so trust
you
me.
sit down with a large cup of cold brew before you get involved. But it's something that you can constantly go back to as well too. So it's like a great book that you read chapters at a time and take what you need, and you always be able to come back to this and get what you need at a time that's challenging for you. So thanks
So
everyone.
good to hear, because as I was writing it, I'm like, this is really long. Is it going to be worth it? So thank you. Allie, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I do. I think the report is great. I sent it to a bunch of people that like analysts in the market that I know. And my boss, I was like, everybody needs to read this and figure out where we are in our journey. And I also think just in general, as I'm like thinking about things that are going on in my company right now, keeping things as simple as possible is always like, that should be your underlying mantra of like, we are overcomplicating this. Take a step back. There's got to be a more simple approach, because the simpler you can keep it, the easier it is for people to adopt and understand.
Wonderful.
You have come to my TED Talk.
Thank you, everyone. Keep it classy. See you in San Diego and have an excellent day.
Bye.